Hello, this is Cameron Gillespie, and my topic is historiography of the Lost Cause. So we'll jump right in. What was the Lost Cause? Well, to put it simply, it was the South's version of what really happened in the Civil War, even though it was not true. It's a history that says we didn't fight this war over slavery. Um, we fought it over something as vague as states' rights. We didn't start the war. Sometimes people who are lost cause disciples will call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. Um, the slaves were happy under slavery. They didn't want to be free. Things that we know are not true. Confederate generals were better than Union generals. Confederate soldiers were better than Union soldiers. You get a lot of that in lost cause narratives. And my favorite is always we weren't really beaten. They just had more men than us and more equipment, and they could outlast us. So my thesis statement is this. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lost cause historical narratives downplayed or avoided the role of slavery in causing the American Civil War and glorified Confederate leaders while marginalizing Union leaders and soldiers. While new assessments of these narratives emerged in the 1930s, leading to increased interest in the origins, propagation, and acceptance of the lost cause, in more recent years, greater awareness of U.S. racial injustice led to its historical discrediting. The lost cause remains a relevant field of study due to continued interest in the Civil War and Reconstruction. The United Daughters of the Confederacy is going to take up the first part of this lecture. They were the most important group in promoting the lost cause. Uh, their most well-known spokesperson was Mildred Lewis Rutherford, and she was the historian general of the UDC, and she wrote several books, but the one I used in this paper was a measuring rod to test textbooks and reference books in schools, colleges, and libraries. She was born into a family of former Confederate leaders, Howell Cobb in particular. She was a fierce defender of slavery and white supremacy. And what she was really wanting to do was to teach, wanting schools to teach the right version of history, according to her and the UDC. Of course, was that the right version of history? No, of course not. They had to create a history that was more to their liking. And that's what the UDC did. That was their main job. And so a measuring rod was written to as a guidebook for schools when selecting textbooks. And the textbook had a list of things that textbooks could not say, they could say. They wanted these textbooks to be very pro-Southern. You can see on this slide here all of the titles of the chapters. And there's some pretty absurd things in this book. I don't have time to go into all of the details of them. It's quite interesting. So my next source was another book about, it was a book about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Karen L. Cox, who was a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, wrote Dixie's Daughters, United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Preservation of Confederate Culture. Uh, she talks about the monument building the monuments they built, like the one here on my slide in Batesville, Arkansas, where I live, really served to educate Southerners with what really happened in the war. I put true in quotation marks because their version of true isn't the real version of true. Women did found the Confederate tradition. The role that the United Daughters of the Confederacy played in creating the Lost Cause cannot be overstated. It was vital to the creation of the Lost Cause. So the main goal of the UDC was to educate. You have to create gods in this case, and they created two of them, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. You can see there on the right, they're always considered to be godlike figures. I call them demigods. And they are defined as the great heroes of America. They sit at the right hand of George Washington in heaven. Now, as far as Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, well, they're nowhere to be found in this. They only won the war because they had more men, not because they were better generals. I think it's summed up. I call it their gospel. The cause was just, and our leaders and soldiers superior, but we could not withstand all the men and material arrayed against us. We were never really beaten. Um, Most of the monuments that you see today in towns throughout the South dedicated to Confederate soldiers were built and put there by the UDC. Um, One thing that's notable, that guy there, George Wallace on the right, he, along with most of the other white leaders in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, was educated with UDC approved textbooks. So that's going to be one of the reasons why they're so resistant to integration. We're going to move on now and talk about the role of the lost cause in the border states. The border states were the states that remained in the Union. They were states that had slavery. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were the four border states that remained loyal to the Union. So Anne E. Marshall, she wrote a book, Creating a Confederate Kentucky, The Lost Cause and Memory in a Border State, which was a really, really interesting book. I really like this book. And it's an interesting notion that she argues that Kentucky essentially seceded and embraced a Confederate heritage after the war was over. It's an interesting state. It sent more soldiers to fight for the Union than it did the Confederacy. Again, it was never part of the Confederacy. But Unionism gets seen as a stain, and the Lost Cause removes that stain, and Kentucky becomes, by the beginning of the 20th century, fully a Confederate state. The UDC was very, very active in Kentucky, built a huge monument to Kentucky's favorite son, Jefferson Davis, along with Robert E. Lee. And you see a lot of these monuments like we see in my hometown in Kentucky as well. Interestingly enough, the UDC never did anything with the birthplace and boyhood home of President Abraham Lincoln. That was out of state interest that funded that. So moving over to our other border state, Amy Laurel Fluker wrote Commonwealth of Compromise, Civil War Memory in Missouri. And Missouri is a lot different than Kentucky. It's a lot more unionist than Kentucky. And the Lost Cause did not find as fertile a ground in Missouri as it did in Kentucky. A lot of that was due to demographics. You have a lot of German immigrants around St. Louis. And also, you have a lot of people that don't remember the war fondly in Missouri. It was a brutal war. It was a guerrilla war, especially in southern and western Missouri. And it was not civilized at all. So you have a lot more Union soldiers from Missouri than you have Confederate soldiers. You also have a very, very strong Union Army organization, the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, the UDC does succeed in building a monument in 1914, the Memorial to the Confederate Dead in St. Louis, but it was always controversial. The GAR never gave up trying to get rid of it. Finally, in 2017, they did get rid of it. A lot of people in Missouri don't have the Civil War memory that other states have. The Lost Cause is not celebrated in Missouri like it is in states in the Deep South. So I brought up E. Martin Coulter here, and he was a Lost Cause professor, we would say. He was a professor of history at the University of Georgia. He wrote two books that I used as sources in this, The Confederate States of America, 1861 to 1865, and The South During Reconstruction, published in 1947 and 1952. He fully embraces the Lost Cause. Anybody that's familiar with the Dunning School, which I'm not going to go into detail about, would probably recognize the kind of history that he taught. He taught a history that was very pro-Confederate, would have essentially followed along with everything that the UDC said, that it was the North's fault, slavery was a good thing. He essentially said that he was still trying to reestablish the Southern Confederacy in his teachings, even as an old man, long after the Civil Rights Movement had swept over the South. I used him as a source because I wanted to find a really good Lost Cause proponent who was an academic. They're hard to find. So W.E.B. Du Bois, he writes a book, Black Reconstruction America, in 1935. It's a really, really interesting book. And in part of the book, he argues about the fact that the Lost Cause has taken hold. That is, that the nation has obscured the real cause of the war. And why have we done that? He talks about how Americans, even up to the time that right before the war occurred, they knew slavery was wrong. Yet the South wants to pretend that slavery was not wrong, it was a good, and that nobody ever supported abolition. He paints a real accurate picture of what really happened but no one in 1935 is really ready to accept that yet. He's has to deal with a lot of racism. The 1920s and 30s are really the bottom pit of race relations in the United States. Segregation was firmly entrenched in the South. You know, a lot of hostility towards African Americans in the North as well. But Du Bois is going to be recognized later. The civil rights movement is really going to start, I think, with a seed that he planted. So moving on, Gaines Foster, back in 1987, he wrote Ghost of the Confederacy, Defeat, the Lost Cause, and the Emergence of the New South. And he uh, argues that the lost cause was created to heal a wounded self-image of the South. Um, there's two basic tenets of the lost cause, according to Foster. Overwhelmed by numbers, and Longstreet lost it at Gettysburg. That's the gospel of the lost cause. He does mention that right after the war, slavery is acknowledged as the main cause of it. But once reality sets in, Southerners become defiant and say, hey, we got to have a better cause that we fought and died for than slavery. We'll be condemned by history if we say we fought to defend slavery. So they come up with all sorts of other things, like I talked about. They were fighting to preserve the Constitution. They were fighting to protect states' rights, things like that. He was a really, really good source for this paper. Dissent and Resistance Against the Confederacy. Victoria E. Bynum, she wrote a book that was extremely, extremely interesting. The Long Shadow of the Civil War, Southern Dissent and Its Legacies. It wipes away one of those other myths that there was a completely unified white South. It was more than happy to send its sons, its husbands, and its fathers off to die for the Confederacy. A lot of people didn't like the Confederacy in the South, especially in marginal areas like the Quaker Belt in North Carolina, Jones County, Mississippi, the Free State of Jones, as it was called, the Big Thicket of East Texas. There were a lot of people that did not want to fight in the Confederate Army. There were a lot of people drafted into the Confederate Army who did not like it. They did not like the unfair conscription laws that allowed wealthy people to avoid conscription, and the wives and the daughters left at home did not like the taxation policies. Tax in kind, where a large percentage or a large portion of their farm produce was confiscated by the Confederate government and used to fund the war. A lot of violence in those places. It was violence of Southerner upon Southerner, something that the Lost Cause would prefer you don't know about. So black Confederate soldiers, that's another Lost Cause myth. People ask me all the time, well, there were more soldiers, black soldiers that fought for the Confederacy than fought for the Union. And that's absolutely not true. At the time, you know, Kevin M. Levin, in Searching for Black Confederates, the Civil War's most persistent myth, he says something really striking. The idea of slaves serving in the Confederate Army would be absurd to the actual soldiers who served in that army. He debunks that myth. There is no evidence anywhere that there were any Confederate soldiers who were African American who were recruited and trained as combat soldiers. There's absolutely no evidence of that. As historians, we're trained to work with evidence. We've got to have evidence to back up our arguments. The only evidence that Kevin M. Levin found was that black Confederate soldiers were the creation of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, which is a fraternal organization that is open to descendants of male Confederate veterans. It was created in the 1970s because they wanted to make the war seem less racist. There were blacks that served as personal servants, cooks, musicians, foragers, and other tasks, but there were no real black Confederate soldiers. It's a myth. There were a few black soldiers that were beginning to be trained in the last week of the war. The Confederate Congress, at the urging of General Robert E. Lee, had passed a bill that allowed for blacks to be inducted into the Army. But it never really came to pass. There were some misleading photos, like the one on the cover of that book, like of Andrew Chandler and Silas Chandler. Silas Chandler, who's the slave, he was not a soldier. He never fired a gun in anger. He just had a really fun picture taken, if you can call that fun. So the last source I used was a guy here from my native state, Arkansas, W. Stuart Towns, who was a professor up at Southeastern Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, and he studies the oratory of the Lost Cause movement. Towns sees the Lost Cause as an American version of the Icelandic sagas or Homeric tales of the ancient Greeks. And so things like that are pretty good comparisons, I think. It's like mythology. So in Enduring Legacy, Rhetoric and Ritual of the Lost Cause, he talks about this. He talks about how the Lost Cause was created by the South, adopted by the North to appease damaged egos. And Lost Cause orators wanted to blame everyone but themselves for the calamity that they caused. He talked about how some compared themselves to Anglo-Saxon warriors who fought under Harold against the Normans. Of course, the Anglo-Saxons and the Confederates have one thing in common: they both lost. But he ranks it up to the Civil Rights Movement because, like I mentioned earlier about the UDC, the Southern politicians of the Civil Rights era, George Wallace, Ross Barnett, Orville Faubus, they all went to school when they were kids reading textbooks approved by the UDC. They were in classrooms. They had a picture of Robert E. Lee next to George Washington. And so they brought up the Lost Cause myth during the Civil Rights Movement, but it did not work and integration did occur. So conclusions on this one. The Lost Cause has not been considered a legitimate narrative for many years, but why does it refuse to die? Some people just like an alternate version of history better, even though it's not true. What parts of the Lost Cause are alive and well in our society today? Well, you still see plenty of Confederate flags in the South. I've had numerous people say to me, well, you know, the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. And they list off all of the alternative reasons it was over. And are there monuments to lost causes anywhere else in the world? I'd like to find out. I don't think they are. St. Jude's the patron saint of lost causes. Maybe he can find us one. But this has been a very, very interesting experience. I've very much enjoyed it. And I hope you learned something from this presentation. Thank you.